Now the first obvious step is to measure the areas that I'm going to insulate. I'm going to be using 3M Thinsulate Acoustic thermal wool insulation, which is about 1.5 inches thick. I'll leave links to all the products and tools I use in the description below. So this stuff has both thermal and acoustic properties, so it's perfect for vehicle insulation because it will severely dampen road noise and also keep the extreme temperatures outside the van out and the comfortable temperatures inside the van in. Another big benefit to this insulation is that it's flame resistant while also being moisture resistant, which means you don't really have to worry about mold and mildew. Now to cut this stuff, I was just using your standard utility knife or box cutter with a nice new sharp blade. However, again, just like the Kilmat, I would suggest getting a good pair of utility scissors or shears, something large enough to comfortably cut through the insulation's 1.5 inch thickness. Okay, so now that I've got some pieces cut, first I want to dry fit them to make sure they'll fit. Now the glue I'm using is 3M 90 spray adhesive, which you can find at pretty much any hardware or home improvement store. It's a contact cement, so for best results, be sure to spray both surfaces. Be prepared to buy a lot of this though, because you're going to need a lot of it. Now of course, because I've never done this before, I put the wrong side of the insulation facing out. But you're actually supposed to put the black fabric side of the insulation facing out. I figured it was better to glue the black side because it would hold to the side of the van better, but actually to get the proper thermal effect, the black side should be facing out. In my case though, the acoustic dampening effect is more important than the thermal effect, so I'm really not worried about it all that much. I might go back later and put another layer in properly. Oh, and by the way, it's a good idea to have two people doing this together. I had my dad to help me, and especially when you're gluing in the larger pieces, and later you'll see when doing the panels, it's best to have two people moving and maneuvering these things around and into place. Now in the small bays and in the nooks and crannies of the cargo frame, not a lot of glue is needed. In those nooks and crannies, you can just stuff small pieces or scrap pieces of insulation in there. And the smaller open areas, make sure to measure and cut your insulation big enough to fit in behind the frame as well. What I did that worked for me was to fit in all the pieces and then go back and just use a little glue to tack them in so that they don't move around. Mainly with these smaller pieces, the frame will hold them into place if you make them the proper size and really don't leave a lot of gapping. In the deeper frame areas, I doubled up the insulation. Now in the structural frame itself, you can just stuff and stuff and stuff bits of insulation in. No need to overthink it. Alright, so the insulation is done in the walls. The nice thing about insulation, it doesn't really have to look pretty. It just needs to be there to do its job. Now let's get started with the finished wall paneling. The panels I'm using are a pre-cut 3/16 thick plastic paneling made specifically for my van make and size. I went this route because they're much less expensive than the prefab plywood panels you can buy online, and I didn't want to go through the hassle of making my own. I just wanted to buy something that would fit already. Oh, and this plastic paneling is much lighter than 1/2 inch plywood paneling, so they're saving me a ton on weight. Now the first step is to laminate the outside of the panel with a 1/8 thick Landau foam membrane. This process is pretty easy. You can just cut the foam so it's a little bit bigger than the panel itself. In my case, my foam sheet wasn't large enough to cover the whole panel, so I had to do it in sections. I positioned the foam on the panel, then I used some squeeze clamps on one end to hold it in place, then fold over the other end, folding the foam sheet in half. I placed a piece of scrap wood over the fold to keep it from moving or being blown by the wind. The glue I'm using here is 3M 74 foam adhesive. This too is a contact cement, so be sure to spray both surfaces. Also, you'll need a lot of this stuff too. The foam is super easy to stick down once the glue tacks up. Because the foam is somewhat rigid, you'll really just need to roll it back into place and then stick it down evenly. If you're going to make a seam in the foam like I had to, just make sure to make your seams tight, because if there is any gapping, it will show in the finished fabric in the next step. You'll notice too that when spraying glue over finished surface, like along the seam, I'm using a piece of cardboard to prevent any overspray from getting on the finished outside of the foam. Once the panel is completely laminated, just flip the panel over and trim the foam off flush with the panel. You really don't want to wrap this stuff around to the back. And now we just flip the panel back over to the front, and now we're ready for fabric. So this stuff is just some fabric that I bought from my local Joann fabric store. They're always having 30 to 50% off coupons, so I got a really nice outdoor fabric for much cheaper than buying off those camper van sites online. Unfortunately though, I couldn't get the fabric in a size big enough to cover the entire panel in one shot. Remember to trim your fabric about 6 to 8 inches larger than the panel, so you'll have more than enough to wrap around to the backside. So just like the foam, I did a dry layout of the fabric and marked on the foam a dotted line where the seam would have to be. And then I went up a couple inches to make sure that I would have sufficient overlap. I made my seam towards the bottom of the panel so it would be covered later on by the folding bed that we're going to install. To stick down the fabric, I used the same 50-50 method I used for the foam. And I'm using the same glue that I used for the insulation, 3M's 90 spray adhesive. Remember, it's a contact cement, so you've got to spray both sides. Once the lower third of the fabric is stuck down, I need to prep my seam in the upper piece of fabric. I wanted to make a nice folded seam, so I folded the top piece back about a foot from the bottom. Then I used a straight edge to make a nice straight, even line about 2 to 3 inches down from the factory edge. It's important to use the factory edge of the fabric here. Then I sprayed glue from that line to the edge of the fabric, again using the cardboard to protect from overspray. Then I carefully folded the factory edge of the fabric down to the line I previously marked and flattened out the seam, keeping it as straight as possible. It is kind of hard keeping that fold straight with the glue inside the fold, but I think I did a pretty good job. Please let us all know if you know of a better way to make a nice straight seam. So now that I've got a nice finished seam, I can fold it over, and I want to use a tape measure to make sure the seam is perfectly parallel with the bottom of the panel. I secured the ends of the fabric with squeeze clamps and then proceeded to use again the 50-50 method to glue down the rest of the panel's fabric. Make sure to work it down good, working it from the inside to the outside edges. Now when gluing down the fabric, the two mistakes I made were trying to glue too large of an area at once and not using quite enough glue. If you try and glue too large of an area, by the time you get both surfaces sprayed down with glue and you go back to stick them down together, the glue may have dried too much and it won't bond properly. And then if you skimp on the glue, then you'll get pockets that really don't bond properly. And that can create bubbles that just won't stick down because there isn't enough glue there. So don't cheap out like I did. Use a little more glue than you think may be necessary and you'll be better off in the long run. So now that the front fabric is all done, let's flip to the back and wrap the extra fabric around to the back of the panel. Again, the guys from ABC Rig have a really great video on how to do this, how to glue and trim the corners, both outside corners and inside curvatures especially. Basically, you want to glue down the straight sides first and work up to the outside corners, and then stick down the actual corner itself, and then stick together the excess folded fabric. Then later on, after it's all done, I'll come back and just trim those folded fabric pieces off. For the inside corners and curves, you just make some relief cuts along the curve or the corner, leaving the cut back about 1/4 inch or so from the actual panel, and then fold it around the edge. Be sure to pull it nice and tight as you wrap it around the inside corners so that you can stretch the fabric to conform it to the inside of the curve better. Now I'll go back and trim off those excess pieces of fabric flush with the back of the panel. So next I had to poke the holes through the foam and fabric for the panel mounting pins. These panels come pre-made with these mounting holes, so you definitely want to take advantage of that. So in wrapping the fabric around to the back, if the fabric is going to cover the holes, then it's a good idea to make a mark on the fabric with a marker where those holes are. That way, after you cover them, it's a lot easier to go back and find them. I believe I used a 1/2 inch drill bit, the same size as the holes in the panel themselves. Now when drilling, be sure to put 2 fingers on either side of the hole on the front so as to prevent the pressure from the drill bit from delaminating the foam and fabric from the panel. Now that we've got the panels wrapped, it's time to install. This is probably one of the easiest, if not the easiest step in the whole process. Since all the mounting holes are pre-placed and drilled, and I poke them through the foam and the fabric with the drill bit, It's simply a matter of getting 1 or 2 on each corner to line up with the mounting holes on the van frame, and then the rest go in fairly easily. Now before we go any further, I've got to get the wheel well cover installed that fits behind the panel. So I bought these Legend wheel well liners from the same place I bought the wall paneling kit. They do come with a thin sort of sound deadener inside, but it looked kind of chintzy, so my dad had some old cloth carpet padding lying around, so I cut up a few pieces to fit in the liner and glued it in. For this I used 3M 77 general purpose spray adhesive. This stuff is not necessarily a contact cement, though it can be used like that, but for this purpose I just really needed to glue one side. This fabric padding should provide really good sound deadening and even some insulating capabilities. Once the liner is prepped, I simply slide it underneath the wall panel over top of my wheel well. Now typically these are also meant to have the floor installed on top of them also to cover that lower lip, that lower edge. But in my case I had a floor installed well before I even purchased the wheel well liners, so it's just going to have to be held in by the wall panel. So really the only thing left to do is to finish off installing the mounting pins in the panels, and the walls are done. As we take a look around, the paneling behind the tool rack looks really nice. I didn't film this area, but we actually had to uninstall the tool racking to get the panel behind there and then reinstall it. If you notice, one mistake I made on the frontmost side panel is that I accidentally made the fabric seam vertical instead of horizontal like the other panels. So word to the wise, pay attention to what the top is and what the sides are of the panel so that you don't make the same mistake I did and make the fabric seams going in different directions. Off camera I also wrapped and installed the small filler panels that go up above the passenger side. Why the main panels don't go all the way to the top, I don't know. But all in all, I think it came out really nice, especially for my first time ever doing this. So thanks for watching everyone. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next video in the series where I'll be sound deadening, insulating, and paneling all 3 cargo doors. So make sure you're subscribed and you hit that little notifications bell so you don't miss that next video. Thanks again guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.